So I would like to introduce Dr. Allison Brooks, who is the co-owner and clinical director of the Brooks Powers Group that's been around for quite a while now. I'm not going to, just a while. And she's a lead psychologist in the interdisciplinary clinical diagnostic and research team at the University of Washington Fetal Alcohol Syndrome Diagnostic and Prevention Network, where she's been working for 21 years. She is a licensed psychologist in the state of Washington. And with the Brooks Power Group, Dr. Brooks supervises the clinical and leadership teams and conducts diagnostic and neuropsychological evaluations, school and home consultations, individual and family counseling, and parent and professional trainings. She completed a predoctoral training in the Autism Center, the Child Development Clinic, and the FASD program at the University of Washington Center on Human Development and Disabilities in Seattle, and in the Neuropsychology Clinic at Mary Bridge Children's Hospital in Tacoma. Her postdoctoral internship was completed through a CDC-funded investigation of home consultation interventions for families raising children with behavior problems and neurodevelopmental disorders related to prenatal alcohol exposure. Please help me welcome Dr. Allison Brooks. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been an amazing day, and it's a privilege and an honor to share the role of speaker today with so many remarkable people. I learned a lot today. I'm also filled with joy and hope to have so many people interested in this topic and interested in bringing more light to people who experienced prenatal alcohol and drug exposure. Since the beginning of my career, early in my career, I was working in autism and fetal alcohol syndrome, and I've watched autism flourish sort of as a topic of attention, and the growth for attention to FASDs and prenatal exposures has been much more slow to develop. Listening to Cody talk today about soil conditions and community conditions to support growth and regeneration gives me a lot of hope that that's exactly what we're doing here today. And I'm glad that all of us are here to remedy this. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about meeting the needs of students impacted by prenatal exposure to alcohol. And the information that I'm going to be sharing today comes partly from research literature, partly from other literature, and mostly from the people and the families that I've had the privilege to work with along the way, and that I've had the privilege to serve and connect to. About half of today's talk will be focused on identifying typical educational challenges faced by students with prenatal alcohol exposure. I'll summarize tips for providers, families, educators, people who are here, I hope, and then provide some resources. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is one of the terms that I'll use, and I'll probably alternate between FASD and PAE. FASD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. Neurodevelopmental disorders are present at birth. They reveal themselves over time, and they're usually invisible. They're highly variable. This is true for all neurodevelopmental disorders. As a clinical psychologist, I spent a great deal of time interfacing with the diagnostic systems that we use. And so this term neurodevelopmental disorder, I think, is an important one to call out, because I think of neurodevelopment and neurodevelopmental differences as far more than just disorders. The disorder presents itself when the systems that serve us in the communities in which we live do not provide a match for those differences. And that's when I think we can call them a disorder. Otherwise, they're something remarkable and represent individual differences that we all have. All right. So This conference today is focused on prenatal exposures to alcohol and substances. I'm focusing a little bit more on prenatal exposure to alcohol, primarily because of my own experience and the literature that we have that gets into this area. I've already talked a little bit about the terms, but I'll say from learning to read to reading to learn, our brains are forming connections upon foundations that were laid before birth. And the prenatal exposure to alcohol affects those foundations. That exposure affects where neurons go, the migration during development, how the synapses get pruned and connected. And we know that brain development is impacted by more than just alcohol. It's impacted by genetics, by teratogens like alcohol, by trauma, nutrition, education, et cetera. As you heard from Dr. German this morning, we know that the stress it's experienced during pregnancy by the gestational parent has a significant impact on fetal development. All right, so this picture here is actually a picture of a little group of cells that is now a healthy and well-developing 12-year-old child. And when you imagine how that 12-year-old child, who is composed of millions of cells, started out as such a tiny bundle of them, and we think about the impact of interrupting or influencing what one cell does during gestation, we know that what's going to happen over time is going to reveal itself only over time. Right. I'm going to go back to this one. When I speak to groups and ask them about their educational experiences, this is sort of groups more in general, what I hear from them is that far more than the content of information that they learned from teachers in their experiences in elementary school and middle school and high school is the relationships that they developed with teachers and the experiences, the times that they'd known that they felt seen, and the times that they felt safe, and also the times that they didn't feel safe. And part of what I'll be talking about today is providing educational environments that feel safe, that allow our students to feel seen and to be seen, and that nurtures and supports them. All right, so part of the challenge of in that meeting that experience or meeting that need of being seen and being understood is the really remarkable variability that exists, not just between each individual with FASD, but within each individual with FASD. And we talk about intra-individual differences, meaning that each person with autism has a profile that's different than any other person with FASD or different than any other person with a diagnosis. And within the groups overall, within the group of people with FASDs, performance in each domain ranges from well below to well above average. You heard Carolyn talk about students in a research study, people with FASD who had IQs that were in the exceptional range. And we know also that prenatal exposure to alcohol is a leading cause of intellectual disability. So you could have two people who have FASDs and have wildly different profiles. These intra-individual differences that are really unusual and unique are not just specific to FASDs, but in my experience as a clinical psychologist, I've never experienced such unusual and wild variation as I have in working with individuals with prenatal alcohol exposure. Right, so these differences can and should be causes of celebration, and they often are, but they are also differences that require our systems to flex and to require adults who are educators or parents or otherwise to be nimble and to be flexible. And the stress that it can cause is really quite significant. So Cody talked to us a little bit about the phenomenon of predictive brain theory. And I loved it when I thought about that in relation to the expectations that educators have in meeting and serving students in their classrooms. because our systems are often designed to serve students whose brains function within this, sorry, I didn't mean to advance there, within this pink band. That band is sort of broadly considered the average range. Actually, it's a little bit displaced here, but and we expect that people are generally going to hang together within that band somewhere. But this is a profile of somebody who has a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, where some scores, like their visual IQ scores, are right in the average range, but dealing with numbers is well below that. Semantic verbal skills are way above that. And then remembering stories is way below that. So we get this all over the place presentation that's really, really tricky to predict and to work with. And very often, we heard about this from a couple of our speakers, when you first meet somebody with prenatal alcohol exposure, you often encounter somebody who seems quite good at talking and interacting and doing well. And it's only after digging a little deeper or staying in a little bit longer that sometimes we get to see things fall apart. And the attributions that people make for those times when things fall apart can be really, really quite distressing. So this place is complicated to understand for adults. How can you read so well and yet have such a hard time following my instructions, for example, right? But imagine if it's that difficult for us as adults to understand how difficult it can be for the child themselves to understand and not know, when I put my next foot forward, am I going to land on solid ground? Am I going to land on one of my strength skills here? Or am I going to land on a pothole, a crust covering quicksand? And not knowing that is a terribly unsafe place to occupy. And the trepidation that that might cause you, and the vigilance that that might inspire you to take in sort of always not being quite sure what's going to happen next, and the self-doubt that that begins to instill in the child can be really quite significant. Meanwhile, the adults and the rest of the kids in the class are turning around and saying, "Come on, catch up, what's taking you so long?" That's a really tricky place to be. And Carolyn told us how exhausting a day at school can be for a child with prenatal alcohol exposure. As a parent myself, I see how difficult and exhausting a day at school can be for any child. So things to know about the tricky patterns of brain functioning in FASD. I say things often look fine at first. And we heard from parents on the parent panel that things weren't fine, that there were some problems, but it was really often hard to put a finger on really what was going on. So half of the preschoolers that were seen at the UW FAS Diagnostic Clinic in the last 20 years had developmental scores that were in the average range, half of those preschoolers. But all of them had severe dysfunction in their brain scores that was confirmed by age 10. So also tricky is that students with prenatal alcohol exposure often do best in settings that are really structured, where there isn't sensory distraction, where one adult is giving lots of praise and lots of attention, and there's only one task at a time. So we often get test scores that look great and don't match the real world functioning reports that we know are true for the same child. We also see that the presentation and functioning for an individual with FASD can look really different from one setting to the next. Oftentimes that means school looks okay, but home is much more challenging. Or maybe home is just much more challenging after a day at school because it's taking so much gas out of the tank for our kids to just function throughout the day at school, to deal with the sensory input, sensory assault that's going on, that Tracy told us about earlier, to keep up with the social interactions, to keep up with the academics, to maintain attention, all of those kinds of things, that by the time the child is at the end of the school day, their tank is empty and they get home with nothing left to self-regulate. We also see brain profiles that are really variable, and Carolyn again talked about this during the parent panel. We see kids know something one day and not the next, and then it can be back again the day after that, or maybe even the hour after that. That variability is real. It's truly happening. It feels like lights flickering on and off sometimes to observe and to see. And it can be very difficult for educators and parents to understand that it's true brain difference that's happening there, because we don't have a paradigm for that, or that's not part of our how kids work predictive brain theory model, right? And this is now our opportunity to say these brains do work this way, and we need to shift the model here. Some common scenarios that that I see and that have been reported to me are students who sound great when they're in conversation and then fall apart when they're following directions. We sometimes see kids who have expressive language that's better than their receptive language, and that's really hard to understand. How can you talk better than you can understand? It must be willful. We see sensory motor problems. Tracy talked to us about those before. They look like poor filtering of information, distractibility, lots of stress accumulating throughout the day, coordination problems, memory problems that look like a kid who remembers exactly what you said 2 years ago when you promised that someday we'd go to Disneyland, and where you were standing and what you were wearing when you said that, but then can't remember every single day to brush teeth before putting on shoes, for example, right? These things don't feel like they always add up, and how can we make sense of those differing skills when we have a model, a predictive model that looks very different? So again, we see academic challenges that can look like basic skills are intact, but as soon as we move from concrete to abstract, things fall apart. So I've had students who learn to read just fine, but as soon as they have to start writing, start reading to learn, that's a much harder skill to keep up with. Attention problems are ubiquitous. We see attention difficulties and even diagnoses of ADHD, and I think over 90% of the children and adolescents that we have seen in the FASD clinic. So that difficulty with attention and that difficulty with impulsivity can be really frustrating, because as you've heard, these are people who are wonderful people, and you get to know these kids and these adolescents, and you get drawn in, and we know that they have great intentions of doing well, and then all of a sudden they do something that is very unexpected. I call it getting hijacked by impulsivity. And when somebody gets hijacked by their poor impulse control, and they do something that they didn't intend to do, we see kids who sometimes say, I didn't do it. And they'll say, I didn't do it to me when I just watched them do it with my very own eyes, right? Or confusion, refusal to admit or accept the behavior. And then sometimes that can evolve into just acting tough in general, because it sometimes feels like it's safer to be bad than it is to be dumb, right? So social challenges that we often see in school-age children are misinterpretation of social cues, pretty universally a very powerful desire for friendships and for relationships, but skills that don't really support that. And we heard that from parents before too, this desire to be connected and to have these relationships, but having people reject over time can be really challenging. We also see that vulnerability, that when people who don't have good intentions see that person who desperately wants to be accepted, and then also is really easy to leave with the blame. These are our kids who are left holding the bat when everybody else started running it as soon as they heard the glass breaking, right? And we have kids who often seem very engaging and may appear more competent than is really true. Interestingly, on paper, when you're sometimes looking at the diagnostic profiles of people with FASD and autistic people, you will see social communication challenges that look like they should be very similar. But in my experience over these last 20 plus years, it's actually a very different looking profile. There are some people who have both, but that's been a much fewer and farther between than I ever expected that to be. All right. The heartbreaking result of kind of that uneven functioning, that not knowing where your foot's going to land, is the feeling of being stupid, or feeling of being a failure, or being told that you're not being, that they're not trying hard enough. And I hear so often from educators sometimes, or from parents, that their children have been told they're not trying hard enough. We also see hygiene challenges, because these are adaptive skills that are required for real world success that don't always keep up with intellectual functioning in this group of people. And those hygiene problems can really interfere with social success as well. And I work with students who often have social awareness that is good enough to recognize that they're different from peers, but that desire to be seen and to connect is really powerful. Also, in addition to rejection, many of our students have experienced multiple losses over time. The traumatic experiences and the adverse events and the adverse communities are quite significant for this group as a whole. And so self-esteem often takes a big hit. We have students who feel unhappy and alone sometimes. So while in the preschool years, we sometimes have children who are looking like they're doing okay, other than maybe an emotion regulation or maybe attention. We have lots of kids who get early ADHD diagnoses, who might be having sensory processing challenges, but generally things are looking okay. And then as they start going through the middle years and beyond, we see challenges grow. We see problems with attention grow. Those social relationships start being challenging and difficult. Friendships that were working before don't work after third grade. That's not as a rule, but that's a common scenario. And we see these difficulties with organizing and managing materials, coping with abstract reasoning, and adaptive skills that are much lower than what we would predict by age or by IQ. This isn't sort of universally the case. Again, many people with FASDs do have intellectual disability, but the majority of them don't. And again, because these are neurodevelopmental disorders and neurodevelopmental differences, and they are related to that brain development, they reveal themselves over time. In our clinic, where we get to spend time with students over time, we'll often see IQ scores that look pretty good early on and then start to fall off a little bit later as abstract reasoning becomes more challenging. It can be really puzzling as a psychologist to make sense of this profile and this information, and it can be really really distressing, of course, for families and for the students themselves as well. So why are we getting these challenges over time? So when you think back to that slide of that little clump of cells, the one that was going to develop into a person and a brain, a lot of those cells are sort of waiting in the wings through those early years of development, quietly building connections between the areas of the brain to allow the prefrontal cortex to become the conductor, right? To allow the brain within that prefrontal cortex to take over the guiding and organizing and all of the things that parents do for kids when they're preschoolers, and then we expect our kids to start taking over themselves over time. We're expecting that in part because their prefrontal cortexes are taking over that role, right? So those connections were building the prefrontal cortex to become the conductor of the brain. And when we interfered with those brain cells early on, but we didn't notice that it was a problem when our kids were in preschool, we can start noticing it being a problem when they start to reach the age where executive functions are supposed to start kicking in. I'll tell you a little bit more about executive functions here. One of our parents from the parent panel mentioned this before as well. So here are some things that I hear from educators about their students with FASD. They're just not trying. They could do it if they tried. I can tell because they have those really good skills that they showed me before. She's smart enough, so she must not care. How can someone so smart be so messy, so disorganized, or so lazy? Really dislike that word, lazy. He's smart, but he has no common sense. I find him baffling. He doesn't make sense to me. And she's doing it on purpose to send me to an early grave. When I hear these things being said, I immediately get a red flag for the possibility of the presence of prefrontal cortex damage or executive function challenges. So when I say executive functions, what I'm talking about is the part of the brain functions that involve identifying goals and setting goals, short-term and long-term goals, persisting through challenges, coming up with strategies, monitoring for efficiency and effectiveness, problem solving, making decisions on experience, bolstering motivation, organizing materials, exerting emotional control, inhibiting impulses, and thinking flexibly, problem solving flexibly, being flexible with other people. A lot of these things can feel or sound like character traits rather than brain skills, but they're actually brain skills. That brain was working hard over all of those early years to start to develop connections between the different parts of the brain. All right. So think back to that complicated neuropsych profile. Most of the tests that allow us to look at executive functions directly are not even available until students are 8 or even older. So think about what's happening at 8 in the classroom, maybe in a 3rd grade or 4th grade classroom versus a 1st and 2nd grade classroom, right? In 1st and 2nd grade, we're learning to read, we're learning arithmetic, addition and subtraction. And then we get to 3rd grade and we start doing projects that take multiple weeks to complete. We start doing science fair projects and building models that go along with paragraphs that we have to write. We have to plan those things out over time and persist in them. Then think about the social relationships that are happening in 3rd grade and 4th grade. The triangles, the I know that you know that she said that she didn't like my hair, right? That takes a lot of working memory and a lot of prefrontal cortex work to manage those kinds of social relationships, right? That kind of drama requires a conductor. You don't have a conductor, it's really hard to keep up. So what does that mean for intervention? Here's what I want to say, and I want to keep shouting, and I'm so glad that I think every speaker who spoke to us before said this too. It's critical to understand strengths as much as weaknesses, and a reason that I don't like to use that word disorder or disability, because the strengths are so important. And it's critical to understand those strengths so that we can take advantage of opportunities to use those, to catch people being good and catch people doing well and notice it and see it and help them feel seen and help them feel safe. That prevents secondary disabilities like anxiety and depression and shame. It helps improve self-concept. It helps develop relationships and provide us with points of connection. And it helps keep kids in the game and keep wanting to go back to school if they know that people are seeing the places where they're trying hard instead of hearing that they're just not trying hard enough. Right? So we can't make assumptions, and we shouldn't make assumptions generally, because that's the sandy ground that doesn't help us grow the crops. It's not the soil. Right? So many of the groundbreakers in FASD who have lighted the path for me as a provider have reminded me of this and said this over and over again, is the work is ours to do as the adults who are serving, right? It's not to be asking our kids and our adolescents to change. We ask them to grow and we ask them to learn, and we provide them with the environment that helps with that. But we have work to do to recognize where we need to do the changing and the supporting and the flexing, right? So that we don't jump to easy connections, right? Jan Lutke said, at the heart of all compliance issues is a competency issue. We have to move from seeing problem behavior as non-compliance to seeing as non-competence. Diane Malbin called this reframing. Carolyn, actually, a couple of our parents talked about Diane Malbin before. Reframing. Diane Malbin says it's not about trying harder, it's about learning to do things differently. So we reframe from saying this child won't do this thing to, oh, maybe they can't do this thing. So we go from seeing a child as lazy to a child who's working really hard just to keep their head up during the day, right? A child who is lying to a child who's trying to make sense of that experience of being hijacked by something, or trying to make sense of a social context that they couldn't follow. Child who doesn't try to a child who doesn't know where to start, because initiating is an executive function, and it's really a challenge for people who have trouble with that area of the brain. A child who's mean or a bully versus a child who is defensive, that vigilant child who's always in fight or flight mode. Sometimes they fight, it's not always flight. Child who doesn't care, shuts down, is a child who doesn't feel safe showing feelings. Somebody who's resistant as somebody who doesn't understand or is afraid to trying to get attention versus needing support and contact, not understanding ownership rather than being a thief, and not trying. They know, right? Somebody who's in need of teachings, or somebody whose wires just aren't connecting today, right? So one of the parents beat me to this, and I'm really glad, because I liked what she said about this being something that was really important, right? The work is ours to do as adults. I'm a parent, and I've heard myself say to my children, how many times do I have to tell you? And then that's my own red flag time, right? That flag tells me that I need to take my own break, just like Corey talked about taking his break with his kids when he's realizing he's not self-regulating well. You heard from Carolyn about the importance of repetition, and that's true. That repetition needs to be compassionate and supportive. It's our work to do, and we can't be mad that we have to do it. Or if we are, we can be mad in private, right? And it's also important for us to recognize when it's time to change what we're saying or what we're expecting. So Walter Barbie said this in a FAS, A Guide for Daily Living. If you've told a child 1,000 times and he still doesn't understand, then it's not the child who's a slow learner. Red flag. How many times do I have to tell you, right? Okay, so how we change what we do as adults in an educational context can mean things like giving extra processing time, providing visual supports, doing showing rather than just telling, making sure there are sensory supports available like noise blocking headphones in a classroom or shortened assignments, preferential seating that might be at the front of the room for one kid and at the back of the room for another, checks for understanding that don't look like, do you understand? But tell me how you understand, right? So as we launch into this next section on educational intervention, I want to highlight that framework for the interventions that we can consider. When we are running into a roadblock, we can ask ourselves, is this a can't situation or a won't situation, right? We can ask ourselves, is this a skill? If it's a can't, what is that skill deficit? We're talking about reading, but maybe it's really attention, right? Or maybe it's really language that's going on here. I need to dig a little bit deeper. I need to look a little bit harder. And then we ask, what can I change in what I do? These are the adult behaviors, the asking, the looking, the checking first. When we get deeper into behavior, we look at things like how to prevent problems, how to provide settings that are supportive and make sure that expectations are clear before we say somebody's not meeting our expectations, and making sure that we're resetting our expectations when we should reset our expectations. Then we follow up, we stay consistent, and then we revise if it's not working. So what that means, to support our learners with prenatal alcohol exposure, we need them to do the same things that we do to support all of our learners. We need to connect and integrate the whole brain. We reframe behavior using a neurodevelopmental perspective. We use a trauma-informed approach. Brains learn better when students feel safe. And a trauma-informed approach works for everybody. It doesn't just work for people who have experienced trauma. Right? A brain that doesn't feel safe doesn't learn. We motivate. We know that the belief in success is far more important than the threat of failure to motivate people. So we want to keep focusing on strengths and building those relationships. All right. So that sounds great. How do we get all that in schools? How do we make that happen? So I'll talk a little bit about basics of special education law. And I'll just say, as a clinician, I find it fascinating that even though children in the US spend 180 days at least in school a year, 6 hours a day, that a lot of our clinical provider programs don't talk about what's happening at school during those hours and how to be an advocate for them. And I'd like that to change, and I'd like to help clinicians be empowered to help connect and integrate with school providers and families as well. All right, so in the US, our federal law says that all children are entitled to an education that is specifically designed to meet their unique needs. And all children are entitled to an appropriate education at no cost to the invisible. I mean, to the individual, sorry. So, but by the way, you're going to need to learn a new language in order to navigate that system if your child has special needs. If your student has needs that don't match that middle band of students. And these are some of the words in that language: IEP, IFSP, IEE, FBA, PBIS, FAPE, LRE. I'm not going to teach you all of those words and those acronyms today. So IDEA, our special education law, provides for ways to access and qualify for education services and interventions for all ages. Part C of this law is addresses needs of early intervention services for birth to through 2-year-olds, or birth to 3. So we often call it birth to 3, children with disabilities and their families. So under Part C, infants and toddlers with disabilities are defined as children who are experiencing developmental delays in one or more of these areas. Many of the children that we have seen in our FASD clinic have social or emotional delays, but everything else is looking okay. And I'm always glad and grateful when we're able to connect services to somebody in this age range, right? in children who have a diagnosed physical or mental condition that has a high probability of resulting in developmental delay. The great thing about FASDs or prenatal alcohol exposure is this means that even if you're not showing a lot of difficulty early on, even if you're one of those kiddos whose early development looks kind of okay, can still qualify for services if that prenatal exposure is documented and identified. Right? This law includes provision for how we find and access these kids and for the plans that we help write for them, the IFSPs. This law, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, was first enacted in 1975. It was designed to protect children with disabilities in the educational system. I already talked about that free and appropriate education, and I have an asterisk there, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Each child is entitled to a comprehensive evaluation of needs, and each child who qualifies is entitled to have a written program developed by a team that includes parents and school representatives, and that plan is renewed and developed yearly at least. Note that appropriate does not mean best, and this is often a point of conflict. We have a hard time even identifying what appropriate means, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute here. I'm wanting to keep track of time. So eligibility and disability and adverse impact, or eligibility means disability plus adverse impact. So the law specifies all of these categories of disability, and the areas that we have found that students with prenatal alcohol exposure are most likely to be served in, unless they have clear intellectual disability or clearly identified speech or language impairment, that kind of thing, is this area, this diagnosis at the very bottom, other health impairment. This is often where we're accessing or qualifying kids who have ADHD, and definitely an area where we've had some success qualifying kids who have prenatal alcohol exposure and a resulting FASD diagnosis, right? But a diagnosis alone is not enough. It's also required that we demonstrate that that child has, or that disability has an adverse educational impact on the child's educational performance. So what does educational performance mean? Well, oftentimes you might encounter school teams that interpret educational as academic, and that's not the way it's supposed to be, because school life is far more than academics. There's so much going on socially and adaptively and emotionally at school. And it's important as an advocate to remember that adverse impact does not just have to mean academics. In fact, somebody might be doing fine in academics and still qualify for having services. There are procedures to get evaluations. Every student has the right to an initial evaluation and then subsequent evaluation at least every 3 years. There are ways to access independent evaluations as well. And here's a challenge though. Our students with FASD, as I mentioned earlier, often do much better on tests than they do in real life. So what do we do about that? How do we capture that on an evaluation? Observation is a really important component of any evaluation. And I urge anybody who's trying to advocate for students in this way to really emphasize the importance of that. Using prenatal alcohol exposure as evidence, and really importantly, never taking a wait and watch stance. As soon as one of our students starts having struggles, we want to act right away and not wait and watch to see if it gets worse or gets better, right? All right. So you've documented the disability and the team agrees that there's an adverse impact. Now we get an IEP, right? Well, not necessarily. You might get a 504 plan. 504 refers to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And IEPs include specially designed instruction in areas of need. 504 plans don't. They both include accommodations. Right, so there's many hoops to jump through in this process. And that specially designed instruction means identifying goals for a student and who's going to teach that skill or help that child meet that goal. So IEP decisions include where a child might spend their time, whether it's general education, classroom, special education. and then teaching methods, and also related services like OT and PT services. I'll talk more about that. Related services are services that are designed to help a child benefit from special education and ensure that they have the chance to achieve satisfactorily in a school setting. So related services on an IEP can include SLP and audiology services, psychological services, OT, PT, recreation, including therapeutic recreation, social work services, counseling, orientation and mobility, medical services, individual aids, transportation, assistive technology, and school nurse services. So, okay, we've got the appropriate educational benefit. We know it doesn't mean best, but what does that leave us with? So in 2017, the Supreme Court heard a case about this, and they ruled that an IEP program must be appropriately ambitious and calculated to allow a child to make progress appropriate in light of their circumstances, more than the minimum, right? So children with disabilities are entitled to high expectations and the maximum extent possible to meet the expectations that are set for all children. As with most law, there's a lot of room for interpretation. So IDEA identifies processes more than specifics so that districts follow rules and procedures, but there's a lot of places where there can be disagreement. This requires advocacy. So how do we advocate? I stuck in this slide here. It's not part of the ones that are were included in the larger group. And I decided to stick it in after all because I think it's really helpful, because so many parents I talk to say, I don't feel like I know what I'm doing. I don't feel like I'm belong, or I feel like I'm over my head when I'm in an IEP meeting. So imposter syndrome is the belief that I know what I know, and I'm pretty sure everybody else knows a lot more than me, right? But in reality, I know what I know, and each other person at the table with me knows their thing too. We each have our own little circle of competence, and the magic happens when we get to put all of our competencies together to serve one student. So this is a page about a strength-based IEP. We want all of the people meeting to come together to focus on strengths and figure out ways to serve and support. So here are some of the key things that I encourage people to advocate for in student IEPs. Inclusion, done right. Staff who have training or get training in FASDs. This is really important. In the research on FASDs, lots of parents complain about having school providers who don't know anything about FASDs and who don't know how to get that information. And there are ways to get those services met, or to get that training need met, and it's important to ask for that and to demand it as part of IEPs. So we want to advocate for staff who collaborate with parents and other providers. We want to advocate for positive behavior interventions and supports, that noticing when things are going well, when somebody's doing things right, to advocate for trauma-informed plans and transition plans. And when I say transition, I'm talking to some degree about high school to post-high school and adulthood, but there are many transitions in the school system, that birth to 3, to pre-K, to elementary, to middle school, to high school and beyond. All of those are places that can be planned for in the educational process. So knowing rights, bringing somebody with you to meetings is a piece of advice that I have, and being the bear that the child needs. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. Inviting others to join their expertise with yours. So connection matters. You ask for it for your child and model it by connecting with a child's team. Educators, I have found by and large, want to know how to serve their students and want their students to succeed, and are hungry for the information that we want to provide to them. So when I say be the bear that your child needs, I'm meaning there's a time to defend and to put on your angry bear face, and it's time to collaborate and connect and be a little bit softer. And it's important to be able to flexibly bring each of those bears to the table when your child needs it. So from clinical providers, do you remember when Carolyn talked about the celebration that that she had when a child got an IQ score that was low enough to qualify for DDA? I sometimes run into providers who want to soft pedal it or don't want to deliver what they think might be bad news, and that can prevent people from accessing services and supports. So it's important to deliver hard news, but also to deliver it with compassion, to communicate with other providers, to encourage you to ask questions, to actively check for a match between the child they saw and the child that you know, and to start with strengths and return there over and over again. As clinicians, we can advocate for the same. We can advocate for clients' best interests above somebody else's approval. We can advocate for our own access to more or different information and training on FASDs. And we can ask for children and their families to be valued and addressed with respect and compassion. And we can ask for coordination of care and coordination between clinical and educational providers. And we can ask for evidence-based practices. More and more educators are asking for information about FASDs. The IEP that I talked about earlier is a legal document, and you can have put in that legal document that teachers and educators working with your child have to get that training. And there are ways to do that. So some of the resources that I have at the end of this project or at the end of this presentation are places to access those. Right, so educators can access for what their students are entitled to, not just what's already available. Access to that information and to the other providers, and partnership with parents. That collaboration and coordination of care that has been a theme that has run through this entire day is one that I believe in with all of my heart as well. And I know that that collaboration and that coordination of care fosters connections both within the child's brain and within the communities that we are working to build and to make more regenerative. I want to center that student and direct all of our competencies there. Educators can also advocate for the opportunity to develop those relationships with our students. It seems like just another thing to burden an educator, but we actually have research that provides evidence that that relationship building not only increases academic engagement and work time for students, it also improves teacher ratings of well-being and decreases emotional exhaustion. Making connections and developing relationships is a self-care behavior. It's better self-care behavior than getting massages even. Connection and relationship are really important. So I'm going to summarize here some of the basics that I go back to over and again. Providing accommodations where it's possible, directly teaching skills and making things concrete as possible, using routine and structure and predictability, thinking positive and being positive. Some of the resources that I have listed here are the FASD PN Clinic, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health organization has an FASD page, the National Organization on FAS Washington State Chapter, and the National Organization on FAS FASD United. There's some other resources here as well, educational ones, and resources for families to access information about special education and transition, and then other transition planning resources, some articles, and these books that are available free of charge to people. They're teaching students with FAS what educators need to know about FASD, and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder education strategies. All right, I think that's probably time to take some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to put up a screen for submitting your questions to our speaker here. And I'm going to leave it up for a few seconds. People have the opportunity to open it.
Oh, sorry.
All right, so
Let's see. Okay.
here's our first question. What are resources for school districts and access to support staff learning and understanding about FASD? Will those be included in the ones you listed?
Yep, there are some resources there. The Washington State chapter of the National Organization on FAS, one of our board members, Jennifer Wisdahl, has put together some trainings for school staff. There are individual providers who can do presentations and connections with school staff. We're working on developing ones that can be distributed more easily to districts now using a telehealth model. So some of those resources that are at the end of that presentation are at the end of the slides are available.
Pull up the next question. Can you speak more about the difference between FASD and ASD?
Sure. So I'll speak a little bit about the commonalities. They're both neurodevelopmental, they both describe neurodevelopmental differences. They are conditions that we can't diagnose typically at birth. We can diagnose somebody with alcohol exposure at birth, but we also need to look at whether that exposure had an impact on the developing brain. We can't typically necessarily identify that at birth. Both have that intra-individual difference is very, very common. So lots of differences between an individual's own areas of strength and areas of challenge. Both also, we expect a lot of social communication differences, but as I mentioned before, those social communication differences can look more similar on paper and more different in real life. The sort of gregarious, sort of good at first glimpse, maybe water cooler or party talk can be something that looks really good and then isn't quite as good later, oftentimes for our students with FASD.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Brooks. I'm going to stop sharing, and some of these questions maybe we'll be able to get to in our Q&A, but I'm going to let Emily take over.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison. That was wonderful.
Thank
Boy,
you.
I think are we nearing the end of the day? I think we are. I'm lucky enough to provide some closing remarks for a couple of minutes and then open it up to questions. I think for me today, I am now looking at my garden in a different way, number one, and what the garden is around me versus what the garden looks like around my patients. And that metaphor struck a really strong, like really makes really good sense to me. And so I'm going to steal it. I'm totally going to steal it. I think other things that I took from the meeting today include what are our circles of collaboration and collaboration models that we have for just not only ourselves, but our communities of people, and how are they different from one place to another, and also the resiliency of parents and caregivers who are taking care of children who can be more complicated. I'm just, every time I hear families speak, I am filled with gratitude. So those are my brief thoughts. I think what we would like to do is open it up for those speakers and moderators, Carolyn, who all are still here with us today. We'd like to open it up if attendees have any other questions, sometimes you have more questions. I always leave the Duncan with more questions than answers. But people probably have some more nuanced questions that they may want to ask after hearing all of the topics today. So I'm going to open it up to an opportunity for folks to ask a few more questions to the presenters who are here. And Hyan, do you want to offer that up again? Is that what we're doing? Or are we going to type it into chat?
Yeah, I enabled people to unmute themselves.
Great. Perfect.
Maybe we can get to a couple of the questions that we weren't able to get to during some of our talks earlier today.
Yeah.
One of them, I think this is for Carolyn. From your experience with other Indigenous cultures, what are strategies that are used that you feel would be helpful for Native American families, communities that are not used in the United States?
Wow. Well, I have to say that having worked in Australia and New Zealand and Canada, Canada has, their boarding schools closed later than ours, but fetal alcohol up there has really, I think, led the pack for quite a while. There's a lot of information. A lot of the tribes are doing things. I was in New Zealand a few years ago and hadn't been there for 17 years, and definitely things were on the move there. Australia is just starting to move in as far as Aboriginal awareness and education. And June Oscar, who was the first woman that invited me to the Kimberley, and she lived in a small village and got fed up with alcohol in her tiny town and ended up taking some grandmothers to the central government of the country and demanding that they stop selling alcohol within the city limits. She had her life threatened, and they ended up bringing near beer only that had to be drunk in the establishment. Nothing could be taken home, and rates of suicide and domestic violence and child neglect and everything just plummeted. And so she then became, I can't remember her official title, but I think now she's the Aboriginal Commissioner for the whole country. June Oscar, just amazing. And she has a program up in the Kimberley that you can just join into their, look up June Oscar and you'll see the website, and they have tons of information and stuff. But, the Native community here has really led a lot of work in fetal alcohol. It was back in the 70s, I think, that some of the first trainings were done, and they were by a couple of Navajo women, I believe, that were out of the Southwest. But the issues, like I said earlier, wherever I go in Indigenous communities, they're the same issues. It's discrimination, it's loss of land, it's loss of culture, loss of language, boarding school. If you ever saw Rabbit Proof Fence, which is an incredible movie about what happened to two sisters, a real story, that were put into a mission far away from their families. So yeah, it's a hard question in a way. But I think, going back to traditional teachings. And, look in the Northwest, the canoe journey. The canoe journey has changed things for tribes here. You are not allowed to touch that paddle or get in a canoe if you've been using alcohol. And they have canoes that are together all year long, working on learning dances and songs and raising money. So there's this constant movement around being clean and sober. And as I look in the canoes every year, the pullers get younger and younger. So we've got more of our youth coming into that, and they're going to end up being parents who grew up in a culture where sobriety was really important and demanded in the ceremony. So the culture for me, in any country I went to where there was an established culture, particularly among Indigenous people, that I thought was the strongest strategy that I came across, really. I always say if information was enough, I'd be skinny. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Now, I think this might be a question for Tracy, who is not here, about sensory profile, but I don't know if Emily, you have anything to share about that?
My opinion is yes, because we're all sensory beings with ways in which we respond to our environment. And so it would be really interesting to, as caregivers, check ourselves and become, we call it like metacognitive, thinking about how we think in terms of how it affects our caregiving skills and how that impacts regulation of those around them. We talk a lot in my line of work about childhood and temperament in general. And are you a person who runs hot? Are you a person who runs in the middle? And how do you react to stimuli, whether they be sensory or emotional or all of that, and how that can impact your relationships with those around you. And so I think that that's a really important thing to think about. And I've never, oh boy, I would actually like to take my own sensory profile. That would be really interesting. I've never really thought about that. So that's a good question, and I think warrants more exploration for sure.
There's just a comment in the chat from Amy Van Loo. The new sensory processing measure -2 includes a caregiver report form for caregivers of infants and toddlers.
That's so neat. That's so neat. I think it should go, I think it's really interesting to go hand in hand, like caregiver profile and child profile, rather than just one side or the other. Sheila McMahon had a question in the chat on the chat side that says, is it necessary to corroborate with gestational parent that alcohol was consumed during pregnancy to make the diagnosis of FASD? If the parent does not wish to disclose, can the diagnosis be made based on features and impairments, or would a different diagnosis need to be used in the absence of corroboration? So if you are real black and white around the diagnosis of FASD itself, which is the DSM-5 diagnosis of FASD, the full disorder, I think you have to have corroboration of alcohol from the gestational parent. I think how we are trying to understand these diagnoses is shifting quite a bit, and we need to be compassionate about and flexible around prenatal alcohol exposure and what that means for any individual child, and also prenatal exposure in general. And I think that the DSM, I mean, we think categorically when we really should be thinking about function in general, and I think we've heard that theme run through this whole talk today. But at the moment, yeah, who else would want to answer some of that?
Can I jump in? This is
Yes,
Julie
please.
Delo.
Yes, thanks, Julie.
So, so as a member of the clinical team at the UW, so there is an option to diagnose someone with fetal alcohol syndrome if, well, the way it would turn out would be fetal alcohol syndrome, alcohol exposure unknown, if all of the facial characteristics were present and there was also evidence of, central nervous system dysfunction. So whether it was microcephaly or, some other type of CNS dysfunction, whether it's functional or structural, and also some type of growth deficiency. But it couldn't be that alcohol exposure had been ruled out. It had to be that alcohol exposure was unknown. Does that make sense?
Yes,
and
that makes sense.
all of the facial features must be present. So we would have to have palpebral fissures below the second, or below, palpebral fissures 2 standard deviations below the mean, and the philtrum is a rank 4 or 5 according to our grid, and a lip, upper lip, thin enough to make a 4 or 5. But it also, technically, is it great if we have it straight from the birth mother? Of course it is. But I mean, the reality is that sometimes that's not going to happen for other reasons other than, birth mother choosing to not disclose. It could be that mom's already passed away. It could be that mom is not available. Maybe it's a foreign adoption, maybe it's a closed adoption. So there's other reasons. But if people are cooperative, if there's a relationship between other extended family members or other folks, then if somebody else, and we believe that that their statements are not rooted in vengeance, let's, I guess, put it that way, that, and they make a statement that they witnessed mom's drinking during the pregnancy, or that they went over there multiple times, and that mom always had a can of beer in her hands, or that she was always appeared to be under the influence of alcohol or something like that, then as a team we would possibly, maybe even probably, accept that as evidence. Or if the social worker says, during the pregnancy, not before, not after, but during that pregnancy, she was evaluated for alcohol, not heroin, not meth. Granted, those, are warning signs, but it needs to be alcohol. She was evaluated for alcohol dependency or whatever, and was found to have a problem and went to treatment for outpatient or inpatient during the pregnancy. So that didn't maybe necessarily come from mom, maybe didn't come from dad. And mom could then deny it later. But if she was in treatment and she was determined to have a problem with alcohol, then we would take that. Does that make sense? That was a long-winded answer.
It does, Julie. Thanks. I think that the thing that I think is challenging for many is the facial features and physical features are not as common amongst the number of children who are exposed prenatally to alcohol. Like, you don't see them as frequently. Yet the neurological.
No, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the physical features, the facial features are typically only formed between the 19th and 20th day of the pregnancy. I mean, so if you've got a mom who is either a binge drinker, or maybe she happened to get arrested, and so she did 3 days in jail during that time. Or when I think about my pattern of drinking as a 17-year-old, I didn't necessarily drink every day of the week. If I was still a junior in high school at that point. And so I did my drinking on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and sometimes Sunday. So I was pretty lucky in some ways that I actually did hit the days so that face does have the facial features. But
there are some questions in the chat about what can qualify you for going to the FASD-PN network at the University of Washington versus Hope Rising. And there are some differences in terms of confirmation of alcohol exposure, Julie, if I'm right. Can you explain a little bit in terms of who can go to the FASD-PN program at the university? Do you have to have a confirmed alcohol or foster care? What's the entry criteria? That
Are you asking me?
Yeah, Julie, because I can't remember. I always forget and I don't want to say something wrong.
Okay, so to go to the U, basically it's just that there is some reliable anecdotal source of information that alcohol passed lips.
Okay.
We'll do everything else once you guys get there. I mean, so you fill out the NPIF on the NP, which is the new patient information form. And once you do that, the biggest piece that we're looking for really at that point is the the piece about the alcohol exposure. And then if you pass that piece that I already said, I mean, that there's some reliable anecdotal source of information that alcohol passed lips during that pregnancy, then Susan and stuff will, you'll get a letter back saying, okay, looks like you meet our qualifications to be put in the queue. And then all the letters then start flying. I mean, so all the ROIs will go out if it is a foster child, so that because the person that submits the request can be anybody. I mean, it could be anyone. And then, so then for the ROIs in that, it would need to be the whoever's got the legal guardianship. So it would probably be then the social worker who is the representative for the state, who probably has guardianship, through the dependency. And they would have to sign all of the release of informations and stuff. And then they give that to the clinic. The clinic sends it all out to the medical docs, to the hospitals, to schools, to mental health, to everybody that we can think of. We gather all that information up. We get you on the calendar for the clinic. And, well, whoops. And we are not a intervention clinic at the U. So we do diagnosis. We do sometimes bring children back for follow-up.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's some notes in the chat about Hope Rising as well, for those of you who can see them. So Hope Rising has therapy services, the same requirements for the diagnostic FASD clinic. At Hope Rising, you need the same sort of requirements as the university, but I think to access therapy services, etc., you don't need that same level of confirmation. Yeah. There's another. Go ahead.
I was going to say, maybe just one last question that came up in the through the previous talk about the father's the father's role in potentially using drugs or alcohol at the time of conception, whether that has been associated with any FASD or drug exposure in the infant.
Yeah, I think I can answer that one, unless Dr. Sherman is here. I don't think she's here. Is she here?
I don't think she's here anymore, no.
Okay. The teratogenic effects of alcohol and other drugs that they discuss happen when they pass through the placenta. So sperm, it's fascinating that testicles really do an excellent job protecting sperm from teratogens, so chronic alcohol use, etc. So the answer is, for the person who is providing the sperm, the alcohol use or other use does not affect the fetus in the same way biologically. But that's a good question.